And so in my family, my wider family in particular, there was one family who I grew up with, close friends with the daughters. His name was Laverne, the dad, his wife's called Bonnie, and they adopted 7 children from Indigenous origin in Canada. And my cousins were amazing, cool people, and it was good. And then I was schooled in 2 different prairie cities, and my second part of schooling was in French language. And so I did my high school in French and my elementary school in French. And so sometimes I lose English words when I'm most nervous, so sorry about that. But I began to immerse in learning in a heart language that wasn't my own mother tongue. And so I learned a little bit about another culture through language, because when you speak a language fluently, you kind of imbibe some of that culture. It's kind of interesting. And then the other bit of my life was the church world. And so particularly on my grandpa's side, on the farm part, they were church planters in the Prairie provinces. My grandpa helped literally build with his hands a church. I think that's the dry stone walling bit, right? And on my maternal side, my grandparents were missionaries, first in Nigeria first in South Africa, then in Nigeria, and then back to South Africa again. And so I was really proud of them. And though it was hard for them to be away from us, it seemed really good, right? These elements in my backstory all were good. You know, when you're a kid, your life is like, this is just my life. I know the people around me, and my life is my life. I don't go much deeper than that, really. But then you start to kind of engage, and your life becomes a little bit interrupted. And so the justice bit becomes an interruption along the side. You're disrupted a bit in some of what you think. And so one part of that is that for a part of the time when we were living in Winnipeg, my family was really, really poor. And we made our ends meet through food boxes that were delivered anonymously by good church people who dropped them off on our doorstep. And we had whatever was in the food box to eat. And being that kind of poor isn't good. It's a little bit shameful when you're experiencing it. I can't speak for everybody. As a child, to know that my parents couldn't feed us was sad, not good anymore. And so you're kind of navigating. My parents are like amazing and good and hardworking, but this is our reality. And so that kind of disruptive moment is like, oh, okay. And then my parents, who are readers, started reading to us things like Cry the Beloved Country and Biko. And we're a totally political family. And we start thinking about apartheid and how terrible that is and how oppressive and evil a regime it is. And I'm starting to think, my grandparents are missionaries in South Africa in a church that's actually not objecting to apartheid. It's just lining itself up in the categorization of the country. And suddenly, like, that's unjust. These people I love are participants in something that's terrible. And so the radical witness that I thought they had because they were missionaries was domesticated by the violence that they were participating in passively. That's brutal for a teenager, because suddenly then you're navigating the space of injustice, right? And then in this church that we were part of in Canada, on the Sunday evenings, I don't think the minister liked preaching twice on a Sunday, and we had like church twice on a Sunday. And so at night, they started showing Tony Campolo films. Pretty cool, right? Because he was like vivacious and animated, and he engaged you in justice practices. But also, he did things that were risky and stupid from my 21st century lens, like the little kid story in the hotel. I mean, safeguarding all over that, right? Or the story, you know, there's just things that are super risky about it. But I also loved leaning into what he was saying. It was amazing. He is this gifted orator that made you want to be radical. And some people like took the leap, but other people can't take the leap. And so then I'm like, whoa, what does justice look like for ordinary? Because if you can't do the Tony Campolo hyper risk, then can you really be a Christian justice bringer? So that's like a disruptive question. And then in my Canadian school, in high school at grade 12, so I'm like 17, 18, you're allowed to choose 2 subjects in English. So I've had French, I'm doing French, and I chose 2 that were Histoire du Canada in the French and History of Canada in English. And then social sciences, I was doing it in French and in English. And suddenly I realized that the English had a different history than the French did. Because the English told the victory history and the French told the oppressed history. And at this point, remember, I'm like totally immersed in the French. So I'm like, these English. What? Oppression? And suddenly I'm like, we are colonized. Oh, talk about injustice. And then I begin to be exercised by that. And then I moved back to the UK. And in the UK, I'm confronted with 2 different realities. One is I don't belong here. I mean, I belong here more now. But back then, I was like an alien and treated as an alien. Beaten up in the school bathrooms in Parswood. It was not pleasant. I did 1 year of A-levels. The British government wouldn't recognise my high school certificate initially, and I couldn't go to university in Britain because we couldn't afford international fees. So what does oppression look like? And then I'm in the school lavatories in Parswood in Manchester, beaten up because I'm strange. And then life unrolls. And then the other thing was the class system. What is this instinctive thing that you do? That within seconds you know where somebody should be, how they should be treated, and who they are. And I'm like, what? This is disruptive and obnoxious, actually. And then there's this whole system that supports it, like monarchy and things like that, I mean, some of you might be down with the king or up with the king or whatever I mean there. God save the king or whatever. But, honestly, for an outsider trying to figure out how the monarchy and oppression and injustice kind of sit alongside each other, particularly from that colonial perspective, starts to be disruptive and provocative. And in my pastoral work then, I'm in postcodes, where actually the postcode absolutely affects the outcomes and the aspirations of everybody I meet. And actually these people in my postcodes are the most beautiful, creative, dynamic, engaged, entrepreneurial, inspiring people, but they can't access stuff that they should be able to access to because they live in the wrong part of town. And it's infuriating and it's unjust and it disrupts you. And then one of my cousins from the Laverne Brower family, Dolores, goes missing in Canada. She had been abused as a little kid and had become a prostitute. She'd run away from home a lot. And my cousin Laverne would go out looking for her in the streets of Edmonton and would occasionally find her and bring her home. She would get clean and then something would trigger her and she would leave again. And it was awful for everybody. And the heart of the family is hurting. But we also realised, me from England, my family in Canada, that actually nobody took her absence seriously because she was an Indigenous Canadian from the streets, a street worker. And so in 2014, about 10 years after she went missing, her body was found and her remains were identified for DNA that had been swept up in a street workers project in Edmonton. And nobody cared, except for the family. But then even worse was this additional layer, which was that the farm that I grew up on that I loved, I'm suddenly thinking about Indigenous rights, right? I'm thinking, where did this farm come from? Whose land was this? Northern Canada, Western. Wait a second. And I discover that there's something called Treaty 6, signed in 1876, taken from the Blackfoot and Cree, giving the land of Canada to the Crown in perpetuity. And so in 1946, when my grandpa left the RAF, because he was a loyal soldier, he got given a land grant. Now, he didn't take it from anybody, but I'm suddenly like, whoa, there's blood on my hands, ancestrally speaking. Boy, this is brutal. And justice interrupts you, right? You can't hide from it anymore because now I know. I can't unknow. And then even worse, we discover through a massive Canadian scandal that you might not have heard of over here, that there was something called the Scoop, that was a government policy in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in Canada, which had a deliberate policy of taking Indigenous children from their kin families and giving them to white settler pioneer families to take them away and deconstruct the whole of their being. And my family, who had adopted 7 Indigenous children in the 60s and 70s, were part of this. Though they didn't know it, because it was secret, it was the weaponizing of families. And suddenly injustice is like right here. And my cousins who find this out through it breaking in the news have to navigate. What does it mean for us to be beloved in the Brower? The clan is like the clan, but also stolen from our kin. Who is our kin? And so my cousins then go on their journey and we all go on our journey. And you know, everyone, like justice is difficult sometimes. So why am I telling you all of these stories? Is it just to kind of indulge myself? 2 other little tiny things. One is that I then became the principal of a Bible college, Theological college, in 2012. And I asked myself, God, what are you doing? I'm living Longsight, where I was pastoring in Manchester. I don't feel like that. I'm a bit confused by this. I felt like I should do it. But then without wanting to put words in God's mouth, but I'm about to do that anyway, just bear with me. I felt like God was saying something like, every institution needs somebody who loves justice to be within it. And so then I started saying, well, what does justice look like in this institution? And so questions about fees or debt or structure or pay or who teaches or how they teach or what we teach or what do students get or what does it mean to join in this community? What does our theology bring to the table? So we're a college, like it sounds kind of odd, Nazarene, but it's a Wesleyan college. What does that mean when you're at home? Basically, it means there's this really high regard for scripture, but alongside that, there's this huge value on experience, on lived reality. There's an enormous impetus taken from the tradition of the church, but alongside the culture around us, saying that our passion for life and transformation has an optimism at the heart of it that says communities can be totally transformed by the power of the Spirit. And how dare we assume that they can't be, because the Spirit can do what the Spirit wants to do. That's kind of the heart of Wesleyan stuff. And so my role there is to say, okay, so how do I become part of a liberative institution? That's still an institution, right? And then as I went along, I also became this researcher for a 3-year period that started in COVID and ended last year in this project called Church Action on Poverty, looking at church on the margins. And that was really interesting because in that space, I learned loads of things about the beauty and ordinary and the joy of communities that are doing living work, if you know what I mean, but also the incapability of some ministers to let people speak for themselves and the mediation effect that the church has when it tries to always speak on behalf of other people. Like, it's just a really interesting world. And so I'm chiseling away at all of this and thinking through these autobiographical, ethno-autobiographical lenses. And I come up with these 3 big ideas for justice. They're not rocket science, and I think you probably know them already. But before we do that, I'm going to do a Senti Pensier with you. I just want you to stop for a second and uncross yourself. And just think of your own story, actually. And this question: when did I first notice that justice really mattered to God? And in the deepest breath you can, I suppose, just settle in to that lived experience, which will be as diverse as the people in the room. So, here's my first big point, I suppose. Invisible histories are all around us, and we have options. Your childlike way of looking at the world is like, oh, it's good, it's just what I know. And then there's this little phrase, Jesus uses it in Matthew 13. He says, this people's heart has become calloused. He's telling them about a parable. They hardly hear with their ears. They've closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. Now he goes on to say, blessed are you, But I was really struck by that because I was thinking that one of the things about Jesus and justice is that we have to uncallous our hearts. We can't be numb. We have to be willing to open our eyes and have an unflinching gaze. That's really hard. Like, when you first start looking at something, you want to look away really quickly. You know what I mean by that? When you first think, gosh, I'm so mired and complicit in this very messy world. I want to look away from that. I'd rather just tell the fairy tale of my life. The easy stuff, the stuff that Ash read out. None of the complexity or the layers, right? But actually, calloused hearts don't let us enter into the land of justice very easily. And so when we have open hearts or calloused hearts, we need to let them be tenderized. I let my husband read this, and he's like, I don't think you should use that word, because tenderized sounds like you're doing something to meat. And I'm like, yeah, I think I mean that, actually. And there has to be something that lets your heart become tender all over again, and all over again, and all over again. Because it's very easy to put up the walls, to hide away, to turn your face away, to look down, to not watch, to not listen. And so our lives, first, they can be good and still marked by oppression. And I want to invite us to own that. So actually, some of you are like, I'm not oppressive. Maybe. But maybe you are. Or lives can be wholly centered on Christ and still not see other people as holy or as made in the image of God or as worthy. Lives can be childlike, but also need to do a little bit of adult work to say, actually, I have to grow into understanding the complexity of justice. The people that we love can be good and less than good in a complex thing. We don't help anybody if we pretend that justice is simple or easy or accessible to everyone in the same way. But the confession, I think, is that uncallousing of our hearts has to happen over and over again. And so at one point I'm oppressed, like I'm dirt poor, I'm a passive recipient of a handout, which is quite oppressive actually in its own way. There's no dignity in that. And I oppress. I'm the daughter of a pioneer who receives land that they didn't own from a king who stole it from a people who didn't really want to give it away. I'm both of these things. And you have to kind of sit with it. Now, your stories will be differently complex. If you're in a postcode, if you have a university degree, if you've got skills and gifts that you learn, all of us are kind of affected by and affecting others in the complexity of our life. So, 70 Pansier. Take a deep breath, right? Are you hardened anywhere? Can you feel it in your bones? Your heart? Your head? Do you close your eyes to anything? So, the second move, I think, is to recognize that when Jesus says, love your enemies, sometimes we have to start with recognizing that we can be an enemy to someone. I was debating about that because maybe you're all thinking, no, not me. I mean, we like to think that we're not enemies to anyone, I think. But here's Jesus. If you love those who love you, cool. What reward will you get? That's the easy stuff. Tax collectors even do that. If you only greet your brothers, well, what are you doing more than everybody else? Everybody greets their brothers. This is a Deirdre paraphrase, but it is there in the text. Gentiles even do that. I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So the first enemy I'm inviting you to think about is yourself. Like the points where you are against, if you like. Because I think mostly we think of ourselves as cool kind of Jesus, justice, practice, people, movers. Most of you are like incredibly remarkable. You are people enfolded in communities. You practice many good things. Brokenness and beauty are drawn together, and you are healers and good people, profoundly good people. And sometimes I think then, stepping into the space to say, is there anybody at all who I am making an enemy of? Even in my head. And I'm thinking, well, what does enemy mean in this sense? Like I'm widening it pretty well, I think, to say, maybe it's the most vile groups around you. Okay. Maybe it's the other who's oppressed you. Maybe it's actually looking at how we are enemies of the planet God so loves. And we're complicit, folks, in positioning ourselves sometimes against the ways of God. It's tricky because like you do the weighing up, right? I'm going to take a long haul flight to Thailand because this is a greater good. But is there something in there that we need to own? I'm saying actually we're just deeply complicit in lots of ways. And so what do we do with that? And so we're called to love our enemies, including the first one and the one here. And then there's the next step, which is, okay, oh my goodness, how do we love the enemy? Do you know who your enemy is? I mean, maybe you're all thinking, we don't genuinely, Deirdre, no enemies here. But I think about the way I, as a passionate Christian living in the UK, think about politics right now. And I think actually it's not a hard leap for me to think of some people that I think really, right? I'm supposed to pray for these people, right? Right. And so I'm kind of saying like, loving our enemies is also a complicated call. How do we love the people in the film that we just watched who are the other, deeply other? What does it mean to pray for those who persecute you? I was saying to Ash, I was on the phone this morning to a friend of mine who works with the Myanmar National Bank, and she was saying to me that 3 of the young Christians there didn't want to be conscripted because everybody between 18 and 25 who's male is being conscripted, and everybody between 17 and 27 who's female is being conscripted. She said these 3 guys fled the National Bank and they were walking to Thailand, and one of them starved to death on the walk. And I was thinking, man, what does it mean in that space to love the enemy? To pray for those who persecute you? Like, this is real world loving enemy, injustice questions. Now, I'm not answering the questions. I'm posing the problem, I suppose, to say, we first have to offer mercy to ourselves because we've received mercy. And then we have to figure out how, with righteous anger within us, that's still important. It's not letting people who are evil off the hook. But it is saying, actually, there's something in the complexity of our justice that says, wow, we're called to love our enemy. And I think that's a really profound part of practicing justice. How do we position ourselves in such a way that we move towards points of conciliation and reconciliation? Because that's part of who we are as Christians. Somehow or other, I was thinking about this and thinking about the big figures where we see this happening around, like Desmond Tutu, anyone? I mean, okay. Some of that's hard too, though, right? Because it hasn't all worked out beautifully well for South Africa. And then I think about Northern Ireland, and I think about Trimble and McGuinness and some of the stuff there, and I think about Wilberforce and all of the incredible people like Frederick Douglass. There's all of these people who populate the worlds of abolition, who also have to kind of journey towards reconciliation so that they can live out their justice in real time. So I think that's a kind of tricky one for us. But I suppose being invited into a space to say, actually, Christians are called to offer feasts to people who might betray us, to engage with the enemy, both in prayer and in real world ways. So, I'm a story person. I met this amazing guy in Syria, Lebanon. Well, I met him in Lebanon. He was Syrian, called Andre. He was a sniper for the Syrian army in the Lebanese civil war. And he had a list of people that he worked his way down, shooting them from a long distance away in the back. And Andre goes into Lebanon, shoots people, lots of them, and then becomes a Christian, amazingly, and starts going to this little church in Beirut. And in the church, he meets a Palestinian guy called Saeed, who's a Lebanese Palestinian, which means he doesn't have identity papers that would let him be treated equally. So he can't access medicine. And Andre notices that Saeed has like a bad back. And he's like, what's wrong with your back, brother? And he says, oh, I was shot in the back by a sniper. And I lived, but I've still got the bullet next to my spine. And Andre is like, no, does that strike anyone else as like enemy to enemy? Mm-hmm. So Andre then fundraises to get the surgery for Saeed's back. And Saeed gets the bullet removed. And then the Sunday I was there, they're serving communion together, and they're the guys doing the like bread and the wine. And it's like, oh man, loving your enemy and reconciliation is real world, real time sometimes. What does justice look like? So my cousins, my beautiful, beautiful cousins who are navigating life, learning their new kin, actually their original kin, because they've all reunited with these families who didn't want to let them go, and still loving the Laverne and Bonnie Browers who raised them as their own, and looking at them sitting down together as family, just like, holy cow, look at what God does. Holy cow is not a very technical word, is it? But look at what God does. Or in an institutional setting, one of our colleagues, Dr Mijal Wee, who's a Korean, who has this group called Bridging Worlds. She draws people together. And she navigated, after 3 years' time, drawing a group of leaders together. She had Chinese, Korean, Japanese, 3 different Chinese Alliance, Hong Kongers, all in this meeting. And she said to me 3 amazing things. One is, it was the first time these nations had gathered together in Britain, all Christians, because their cultural enmity had been quite profound. I'm like, wow, it's amazing. And then she said that 3 of the Chinese churches, who were quite deep, had never met together because they were all from different denominational spaces. And she gathered them together. And then she herself said, as a Korean, leading people who had been part of oppressing Korea was quite incredible. And I'm like, wow, what does God do with loving your enemies? So that's a kind of second thing. Now, Santi Pansia, folks. Do you have any enemies that you're harboring? Should I give you a lot longer for this one? Right? Yeah, you're right. But take a deep breath and feel it in your bones. Are you an enemy anywhere? Who might you need to pray for? For the miracle of beginning to love your enemy whilst holding on to righteous anger. So, finally, friends, my last theme. I've asked us to see and hear and not be afraid to look, and to have tenderized hearts that tilt towards justice. And I've asked us to love our enemy, righting ourselves, confounding the world with our love, absorbing, I guess, a cross-shaped love. Like Jesus's Last Supper was with not just Judas who betrayed him, but with every other disciple who betrayed him too. So, learning the hard task of refusing to hate and joining with Jesus saying, like, forgive them, they know not what they do. But then there's this amazing theologian called Catherine Tanner who says this: Christianity's practices are always the practices of others made odd. I love that. We're supposed to be odd. But also, as we think about all of this and the kind of oddness of loving your enemy and of not being afraid to speak truth to power, there's this also another reckoning and realization that I have, and that's this. It kind of weaves through my story. I don't know that I did it justice, but here's the third thing I wanted us to think about a bit, which is that justice, real justice, is quite often boring and bureaucratic, and that hidden peoples are part of the story of justice. So I've been a bit preoccupied by this idea for quite a while, and it's because I kind of am interested in heroic leaders, like public figures who do amazing things, because they're catchy, aren't they? And amazing and wow, and they make justice look sexy, and they're quite dramatic, and they're authors and global leaders, and they're powerhouses, and they're driven and amazing. And some of you are in the room, and I bless you and honor you because you're fantastic and incredible at what you do. Heroic, even sacrificial. Like my heart is like, wow, these people, right? But then I also think about another mode of justice, which is the bureaucratic, boring one. And I was thinking about this because I was reading Acts 10 recently, and it's just a little snippet. I should read the whole chapter to do it justice, but if you're not Bible people, this is basically a story of Peter having a massive conversion experience. And he does it by going on a roof, and this is what it says. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey, this is Cornelius and some Roman people coming to Peter's house, Peter went up on the roof to pray. Good for you, Peter. He became hungry and he wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. And then in this trance, he discovers that he's supposed to break every taboo of his religion. And he's supposed to widen the doors of the faith. And he's supposed to allow the Holy Spirit to be unleashed in awesome ways in the world. And the world changes because of what he does. I think we can mostly agree that this is like an incredibly powerful moment for the church, because it's when the circle is like widened incredibly. And we lean on it for our ideas about inclusion and welcome and embrace and drawing people in and saying there's no barriers. Look, if a Jewish guy can go and love a Roman soldier, where the last memory of a Roman soldier he had was crucifying Jesus, this is a pretty amazing moment for the church, right? And we're like, yeah, go Peter. And I love that. But did you notice that tucked away in this story, while Peter is doing Peter's thing and the Gentiles are doing their thing, somebody somewhere is making lunch. And that's so that Peter, in the power of the Spirit, can do his thing. And among the hidden threads of justice is this one, that somebody somewhere puts the kettle on. And somebody somewhere makes sure that the doors are open on time. And somebody somewhere is going out to work in the morning and saving everything that they can so that they can invest in the lives of others so that people on the border of Thailand and Burma can be free. And somehow or other, in this specific story with Peter, later on in the story, Peter like invites these people to stay overnight. And you're like, somebody somewhere is making the guest room, right? And somebody somewhere is now like, we've got 3 days worth of meals. Or, we've got dinner. Like, oh, okay, and what do Romans eat? And there's all of that going on in this story. And I absolutely love this story because when the Spirit then falls a little bit later on, it's described, it's like powerful. The Spirit falls on the whole household, which means that the people in the back room who've now made the bed for Peter and made lunch and breakfast for him are also included in the power of the Spirit. It's just we don't know their names because justice is often hidden and boring and less than dramatic. But actually, are they not part of justice playing forward? Of course they are. They're part of the story of God unfolding in the world and letting the kingdom come. And so there's something about the mustard seedness of justice that's absolutely imperative because not everybody who has the character for justice has the context or the circumstance that lets them be radical in the way we understand radical. I love the idea of ordinary radicals. And I also think, you know what? It doesn't feel very radical to get the kids up in the morning, get them to school, sort them out, be friendly to people at the school gate, to be nice to the dog when you get home and they've eaten everything, it doesn't feel very radical. But actually, in the practice of the ordinary, justice is also unfolding because God's at work in those moments of ordinary life. And then there's the bureaucratic justice. I was wowed by Dottie's story of enabling people to email the surgery. That's bureaucratic justice at work, right? Mm-hmm. Because actually she's enabling people to do something they couldn't otherwise do. And only somebody in her ordinary role could do that. Or I think about Pauline, my colleague, who's our operations director, who reads the fine print of every contract that we sign to make sure that we pay the real living wage, not just to the obvious people, but to the subcontractors. That's bureaucratic justice. Oh my word, it would do my head in. But she's making it happen. Or I think about the little stories here and there of people who are doing these incredible things who they think they're doing almost nothing, right? My grandma, who nursed her entire life so that the farm could be sustained. Her funeral was the biggest funeral our family had. Not because she was testifying mightily all the time, but because she oozed kindness and mercy in the way she did her job. What does justice look like? Well, it often looks a little boring. And for somebody like me, in the world I'm in, I feel like I have levers of justice. I have power. I know I do. So what do I do with the power that I have? It's often bureaucratic. We have this program at the college that lets people who are asylum seekers come and study for free. And it's kind of an underground program. But one of my colleagues went to the University of Manchester, who validates us, and negotiated with them that they would also waive their fee. And so we can offer asylum seekers a theology degree that nobody, unless this person experiencing asylum tells their own story, none of the other students know who they are because it's their story. And every time somebody graduates from this, they come to me and they're like, you have no idea what it meant that I could get a degree like this that will set me up for life like this, with nobody looking at me as an asylum seeker, but seeing me as their peer. It's pretty cool, but it's so bureaucratic. It's hidden. It's not very sexy, but it's way down there behind the scenes. So here we go, everyone, weaving it all together. Santi pensez for a second with me. Who makes your lunch? Or maybe you're the lunch maker. Just receive the thanks. And so lastly then, what does justice look like when our eyes are opened and our hearts are soft and our discipline to love our enemies begins to creep in? It is discipline, by the way. It takes time, it's hard, not easy. I'm not letting anyone off the hook. I just want to be clear about that. I think it means that we're faithful and persistent and unwearying, and we're willing to be boring for the sake of the gospel, as well as dramatic for the sake of the gospel. It looks like Jesus at home in our lives being sacrificial maybe, humble, loving, merciful, open-handed. It looks like your life, my life, cradled in the palms of the God of the universe, the power of all power, creator, sustainer, life giver. It also looks like living in the knowledge that the long work of justice is long work, really long work. But in our lives, we've been able to cooperate with God, tilt towards God a little bit in the life that we're given. So we have to have eyes to see and notice invisible histories. The truth of human freedom lies in the love that breaks down barriers. That's a Newbigin for you. And then we have to have the strength to recognize that in our quest for justice, sometimes we harbor anger or hate, and that's not really Christian justice. It's a type of justice, maybe. But if we refuse to hate, the power of love begins to infuse our being. Merciful to others as we've received mercy is something to lean into. And then we remember the ordinary people in mundane jobs alongside the amazing and magnificent extraordinary people doing radical things. We lift them up. We hold their arms up, right? But actually we willingly do the mundane, exercising the power we have, which sometimes might be tiny, sometimes might be big. It sometimes might be a smile to a lonely person, and it sometimes might be setting someone free. Sometimes justice is mundane. And so we honor all of those enablers who are making the lunch while we do other stuff, right? So Galatians says this: don't get tired of doing good. At the right time, there'll be a good crop if you don't give up or quit. Right now, so therefore, every time we get a chance, let's work for the benefit of everyone. And don't forget to start with the people closest to us in the community of faith. They need justice too. So lastly, senti pensier, deep breath. Clench your fists and then unclench them slowly. Take a deep breath in. And if you will, allow yourself to encounter in your mind's eye, the eye of your heart, who you are engraved on the palms of God's hands. And remember all over again that God's love is for you, enabling you. The end.
Thanks.